Have we got enough chairs?
Right.
So it's spread. Richard stole your copy.
Well, no, that's some.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
There's a seat just up there. Oh, there's one there. Brilliant. Okay. Thanks, Richard. Okay. Right. I'm just here for the housekeeping part. So we're not expecting any fire alarm tests today. So if we do hear a loud noise, we need to evacuate and assemble in the car park. If you've got a mobile device of any description, it's entirely up to you what you do with it, okay? The only proviso I will say, we're in 2013 now, so if it does go off, it's £10 per ring, per vibrate that will be donated to the Business Network charities. So the choice is yours. Without further ado, I'll hand over to Ian, Vicky and Hugh.
Hugh. Right, we better start that one again because we're not who we say we are. Well, good morning everybody, and Happy New Year to you all. Thank you very much for coming along to this seminar. Perhaps the first thing we should do is introduce ourselves, and in time-honoured fashion, we'll go ladies first.
Thank you. Hi, I'm Vicky Stewart. I represent Tender Victory, my business, and I've been running for just over 2 years. Prior to running Tender Victory, I worked as a buyer for the police, so I was a public sector buyer for 6 years. So that's my background to tendering and the experience I've brought with me today.
Ian?
Morning everybody, my name is Ian Smith and my business is called Winning Tenders. As you can see, I've got a few grey hairs, a few years I've been around the block a bit. I've worked in public transport, I've sold copiers, I've sold second-hand cars. It was when I was selling copiers for Kodak that I got into tendering. That was 25 years ago, and I've been doing tenders for all that time, so useful experience. So it's Ian Smith, Winning Tenders.
And finally, and definitely least, I'm Hugh Graham. I have no hair, so I've passed this stage there, so I aspire to grey hair. Have I been around the block several times? I guess the answer to that must be yes. My background is all commercial. I've worked in sales marketing for the wrong end of 30 years, and have been working as a bid coach, bless you, for this is my fourth year in business. Okay. We are basically going to split this presentation between us, and we're going to give you a whistle-stop tour really of the process of potentially winning contract business from the very beginning of that process through to the very end and the successful delivery of that process. The way we're going to do that is basically, I say, take you through the A to Z of that, everything from identifying, okay, how do I find this business, where do I find this business, through actually completing the paperwork and all the administration and bits and bobs that goes with that, through to effective communication should you be interviewed or be required to do a presentation. We're happy to take questions as we go or save them to the end. The choice is yours. If you ask as we go and we're going to cover it later, we'll say, but yeah, please feel free to interrupt or challenge anything that we are looking at. Before we get into that, however, there are many myths and mistruths about tendering and about contract business. And basically, we're going to we'd like to dispel some of those before we start. So get those out of your mind's eye and then get you on a clear and objective playing field. And I'd like to hand over to Vicky to do just that.
So, common myths in the process. First myth we have is that the decision is already made and that the client is just going through the process. Well, it's a myth. This is not the case. What you find with public sector buyers and suppliers that are tendering or already have contracts with public sector buyers is that the incumbents will tender lazily. They think the buyer may just be going through the process and they think the buyer knows what they can deliver. Well, if it's not within the tender documents that you submit, it cannot be scored, and if the incumbents are tendering lazy, you have a really good chance of getting in ahead of them. So prior knowledge of what's already happening will not win a tender because it cannot be stored. You have no chance of winning unless you have an existing relationship with the client. Hugh, Ian and I have all had success stories with businesses, with our clients, who have won contracts with public sector organisations with whom they had no prior experience or relationship. So again, it's another myth dispelled. I myself helped a cleaning firm in Exeter win a large contract with Exeter City Council, someone that they'd never done business with before, and also a local firm of lawyers won a contract with a council in the north of the country, again someone that they had no previous experience with. 3, they know us, so why do we need to tell them what we can do? I've already touched on this. The buyer cannot take their knowledge of you and your business into the tendering process. They cannot score what is not presented to them in the documents in front of them. You might also want to think about, in terms of their knowledge of your business, is whether or not they know the full extent of the products or the services that you deliver. If they don't, there may be relevance in this tender for you to bring more about your business into it, and so to enlighten them further. Lowest price always wins. Lowest price does not always win. Anyone that has had any experience with tendering will know that there are weighting systems within the tender process. Quite typically, a tender will be weighted perhaps 60% to quality and 40% to price, or maybe 40-60 the other way, 70-30. Those numbers can change, but there's always a quality weighting. It's never, within a full tender, it's never just about the price. I can present, I've done it hundreds of times before, clearly I haven't, but every audience is different. So you need to think about connecting with that audience, different audience every time. You've got to keep your content relevant to the audience. Hugh obviously is going to touch on this in much more detail a little bit later on, but we just need to be sure that your presentation is more than a competent presentation you've delivered hundreds of times. It needs to be a winning presentation that is specific to the buyers that you're presenting to. And finally, on the myths, tendering is too much of a gamble and therefore not worth the risk. It shouldn't be seen as a gamble. It should be seen as a calculated opportunity. And in that calculation, you're going to assess the opportunity, you're going to look at the contract. You're going to think about how well you could deliver it. You're going to think about the investment you may need to make in the tender process. And then from those assessments and that consideration, you look at the opportunity and you choose if you want to participate. So why does it have to be so complicated? Well, it's taxpayers' money, it's our money that the public sector is spending. So they have to do it transparently and they have to do it fairly. They have to be able to answer any challenges or clarifications that they get on their own processes, which means everything must be documented. They also need to have confidence that you're going to deliver what you say you can deliver, and without ensuring that that's written down and scored and evaluated properly, they cannot demonstrate that they have that confidence if they receive challenges on their processes. They also need to give you a level playing field for winning contracts and winning their business, and they must be able to justify who they award the contract to at the end of the day, and justify that to those that didn't win, and explain to them why they didn't win. So moving on now to identifying opportunities. Thank you.
Thanks, Vicky. And just adding to what Vicky was talking about when she spoke about an audience, in case anyone thought that might seem strange when you're talking about tendering, last year Hugh and I coached a taxi firm to present the tender that we prepared to the BBC, and there were actually 12 people on the evaluation panel. So that really was an audience, and typically if you're shortlisted for a public sector tender, you'll be called in to meet maybe 2 or 3 people, but in extreme cases it can be, in that one it's 12, so that really was an audience. But it's nothing to be scared about. If you get to that stage, you're doing really well. So, identifying opportunities. One of the frequent questions we get asked is, how do I find out about a tender that's relevant to my business? And it's easier than crystal ball gazing, because certainly the public sector, all the contract opportunities have to be published. And they are actually published in more than one place. So I'll come on to that in a minute, but just to put into context what the opportunity is. The gross domestic product of the UK is £1.6 trillion. I can't really imagine the figure that, but I'm reliably informed by the Chancellor George Osborne that that's the UK gross domestic product. Of that, some 43% is public sector expenditure in areas like education, health. We in this room can't do much about pensions, but welfare and all the rest, there are tender opportunities and all that. And that means that there's approximately £1 trillion a year which actually is spent on contracts. Some of them would be with large organisations, of which some of it would then be subcontracted to smaller firms. That happens especially in, say, construction. So there are massive opportunities for people who are prepared to just go through a bit of pain and engage with the tender process, which is what this is all about. There's more and more procurement via tendering. The procurement process is becoming more and more professional. A lot of people I know are saying, you know, they've been doing work for so-and-so for years, but now it's not just a simple quote, it's much more complicated. They've got to talk about their environmental friendliness and their equalities policy with employees. And as Vicky said, it's more complicated because the public sector has to justify that they're spending our money in a trustworthy way. So that's why there's more procurement via goes through the tendering process, and the professional approach will win, whether it's a large contract or a small one. Finding opportunities, a good starting point is the Government Contracts Finder, which used to be called Supply to Gov. Just do a search on Contracts Finder and that one will come up. I'll show you a screenshot in a minute. And on the Contracts Finder there are small contracts. There are typically £10,000 in the £10,000 plus bracket. The large contracts are all advertised on the EU website, Tenders Electronic Daily, and that has opportunities of €200,000 and above all across the EU. So it means anyone in the EU can compete for business here and vice versa, but mostly we all tend to stick to our own country. Then there are public sector procurement portals. There's a Southwest Business Portal, there's Sell to Plymouth, there are the NHS one, SID for Health, there's the MOD Contracts Online. Incidentally, the MOD is a massive buyer and they have a team of people who you can talk to who will put you in touch with somebody who might be interested in the service that you provide. So that they are very helpful in that respect. If you find searching through these websites too daunting, you can pay for a subscription service. They range from something like £200 a year to £30 or £40 a month. And there are several of them. Some examples of B2B Quote, and there's Tender Match and Tenders Direct and Intend. And you register with them, you do have to pay something, but they will, their system will automatically notify you when there's a tender that's relevant to your business, so you don't miss out. This is the Government Contracts Finder website. So you can search for live opportunities and help, large and small. Quite usefully, you can see what's in the pipeline and coming up in a few months' time, so you can get ready for contracts. So it's not a last-minute rush to get the bid in. So that's Contracts Finder. The other extreme is the EU website, which I mentioned. Tenders Electronic Daily. The help page front usefully tells you what it's all about, what is it, how can I benefit from it. It is worth a look. See if you can find contracts on there which are suitable for your business. But remember, they are the larger ones, €200,000 and above. That's about £175,000 and above. So that is the big league. Why should you tender for work? Why should you get involved with this process? If you win a public sector contract or with a PLC that's serving the public sector, for example. It's good bread and butter. It won't necessarily be hugely profitable, but it provides you with a regular income. You will get paid. The payment is guaranteed. It might not be that quick, but you will get paid. And seriously, it won't. They can't play the same game that some big private companies unfortunately got a bad reputation for, squeezing small suppliers. They will pay within a time frame. It won't be. You might have to wait a long time for your money. It helps to give your business stability. It obviously helps you to grow the business, so you can plan your workload, because you know you've got this regular income, and you'll be able to build your track record in the marketplace, so you've got a useful reference when you pitch for another public sector contract when it comes up. And something to be proud of, you'll be providing a public service. So the next questions are around, are you able to deliver? Because for reasons you've heard, they have to be quite demanding. As Vicky said, it's not about the lowest price. The two guiding principles with the public sector procurement people are MEET and VFM. MEET means the most economically advantageous tender, not the cheapest one. The cheapest one could be higher risk, so as Vicky said, they take into account quality as well as the price. So the considerations are what they'll try and get for the expenditures, the highest quality, and can you deliver this, the most reliable supplier, so less risk, more reliability, the most competitive price within the other parameters, again, not the cheapest, and ideally you need to be flexible as well. And can you be innovative? Sometimes with bids you get the chance to present innovative proposals, maybe a secondary bid alongside the compliant one, and the buyers might well be impressed. You might come up with something that they haven't thought of. So typically you have to put in a compliant bid that matches the specification, but if you've got a really bright idea, you could, as long as you've also done a compliant bid, you might have a radical proposal that could knock them for six. And people, if you're on an evaluation panel, if you come across as nice, decent, trustworthy people, and the competitor is less so, you stand a better chance of convincing them that they can have a good supplier relationship with your company. When you find an opportunity that you'd possibly like to go for, obviously there comes a point where you have to seriously consider whether it's worth going for, whether it's worth going through the time investment that you have to put aside to do the bid. It's no good pitching for something that's not really your core business, but you just like the sound of. It really needs to be the business that you're running day to day, and that you're confident and you're a trustworthy supplier in your business. Is it a stretch too far? Don't go for something which is really too big for you. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Don't try and run before you can walk, to use another cliche. It needs to be something that's within your capabilities and won't affect your existing business adversely. Have you got good references? Sometimes you can establish your credentials in the sector by doing a low value contract before, which is not a tender, but where you quote for the work. If it's just a few £1,000 and you're, say, a small building services contractor, you might be able to do some small works, get yourself established, and just simply through doing this quotation, and then you're ready to do a tender when a larger opportunity comes up. But so you need good references, you need to be able to have the resources to deliver the contract. You should only bid for business that you really want. There's no point in pitching for something that is outside your comfort zone and you don't really want to do. It needs to fit in with where you're taking your business, to fit in with your expansion plans. And remember, if you do win one of these contracts, you could be taking your business to a much higher level. And the BBC one that Hugh and I helped the taxi firm in London to win it's actually now doubled the size of their business. We actually thought it was a bit too big for them. They were so confident they could win it. With our help, they did. So their business is now much, much bigger than it was having won that contract with the BBC. You've got to be able to afford to implement it. There may be some investment in equipment, materials or additional staff. So obviously you need to get the sums right when you're working out the impact on your business. And it's got to be profitable. Time and time again you hear that people have undercut or they've pitched low to win business. There's no point in doing that. If you put in a bid where there's no profit in it, that's a pointless exercise. It could be the road to ruin. So it needs to be profitable for you. So make sure your price is competitive, but you're still getting a good return. And don't go for something that's going to have an adverse effect on your existing business. We've got some no-nos as well, so there are crosses against all these. Don't just go for something for the hell of it. We know some people who do that just to annoy their competitors. Don't go for something that you're not qualified to undertake. You've got to believe you can win. So if you don't believe you can win a contract, or you don't believe you'll get it, that will come across in your tender document and if you go to a presentation. You've got to have belief in your ability as well as the likelihood of winning the contract. Don't go for something that's going to stretch you too far. And don't go for something that really where we search for the best analogy for this, but too many eggs in one basket. Buyers don't like to think that if they place a contract with you, that's going to be the mainstay of your business. They like to know that you're getting income from other contracts. So a good guideline would be no more than 25% of your current turnover. And don't bid for anything last minute. Having said that, one of my clients sent me something, so I was up till 2:45 this morning, so completely going against our best advice. But, and despite good intentions, very often people do end up doing things at the last minute. That's not the best way to do it. And if you're doing a bid and you're trying to do other things as well, trying to get this tender submitted very close to the deadline, it won't be the best you can do, so try not to be last minute about it. There's quite a lot of jargon in this business, like any other. You hear things like EOI, that's an expression of interest when you tell the buyer that you would like to tender for a contract that's coming up. There are PQQs, that's pre-qualification questionnaires. Sometimes that's called an RFI, request for information, which is more an American term, but quite widely adopted here by large organisations. There's ITTs, that's an invitation to tender, and the more American version of that is RFP, request for proposal. So that's just a few of the buzzwords. A PQQ is where you pre-qualify, so you express interest, you're asked to submit information, and what the intention of this is to get on the shortlist so that you are invited to tender. The information that you put in a pre-qualification questionnaire is basically all the information about your company that shows you've got the credentials to undertake a forthcoming contract. So it's your basic company information, where you're based, approximate size of the company, your core capabilities. They want to see 3 years reported accounts because they want to know that you're established and going to be in business to deliver the contract. They need to know exactly what your specialities are, you should have some good references too, and ideally case studies of where you've undertaken a similar contract, and you can explain that it's not just you saying, yeah, so-and-so client is highly delighted with what you've done for them, and they will also provide a good reference. And inevitably, you've got to have all your policies in place. You don't necessarily have to have a quality accreditation, but you need to have show that you've got a quality management system, and that you're working towards having, say, ISO 9000 accreditation. And there are all the other policies which the public sector have to pay attention to, again, because they're spending our money. It has to be done properly. Health and safety is obviously crucial. Disaster recovery and business continuity, you need to show what will happen if you can't get access to your office, or if there's a major event which could in theory stop you from delivering. You need to show that you thought about that and how to work around it. You've got to show that you're providing equal opportunities and attention to equalities. They're not quite the same thing. You need to show that you're environmentally sound, you've got a sustainability policy, and obviously quality, as I mentioned earlier. So that's what goes into pre-qualification questionnaire. I'll now hand back to Vicky to talk about completing the documentation.
Thank you. Before I start, if you have any questions on anything as I'm talking it through, do feel free to interrupt me. I'm quite happy to sort of take questions as I go. So, running through completing the document, the bid, the tender documentation, I'm going to talk to you about how to resource it, looking at project managing it, time people, allowing for clarifications. The important part of evidences and proofs that you must include within your tenders, the final documents, and then I'll talk a little bit about feedback. So, resourcing the bid. Before you've received the document, you've perhaps expressed an interest, or you're waiting to hear from a buyer, you need to have in your mind that you should treat this tender completion like a project, with a project plan. There may well be people within your business that you want to get involved in completion of the tender, so you want to think through who those people are, and what they may be able to contribute to the process. When the documents arrive, whether in soft copy or in hard copy, take out a highlighter and read it with the highlighter. With that highlighter, you want to pick out the key dates that are applicable to this process. Obviously, the submission date is the most important date, but there'll be other dates within there. Maybe clarification questions have deadlines, deadlines for you to raise your clarification questions, and there may also be deadlines upon which the buyer will respond to your questions. That's important because knowing when those questions and answers are going to go back and forth will make a difference to how you draft. The other thing you're doing with your highlighter is you're picking out the aims and objectives of the buyer, what's important to them, what you need to pick up on when you're writing your responses. And furthermore, you want to ensure that you're highlighting the bits you can deliver really well, so that when you start writing and drafting, you've got easy reference point within the document that you can then start working back to. So once you've done your initial read of the document with your highlighter, you now understand what the buyer is looking for, and you've probably got in your mind, if you're going to work with other team members, who within your team can contribute to writing. Maybe you'll apportion some questions to some other individuals. So you have now the formulation of a project plan starting. You've got the relevant dates, they're also going to fall into your project plan. So when we're thinking about those people within your team that might be getting involved, there's often a salesperson that will get involved within a tender process and writing tender responses, quite naturally so. But with clients that I work with, I often speak to someone that's customer facing, because you often find little nuggets of relevant information in there that can really bring a response and an answer to life, because it might be specific to how customers are dealt with. It might relate to a particular way a product works, or a particular way that a piece of software works. But these are people you want to bring in and you may want to factor in. So your project plan then needs to, as well as allow for the clarifications and the deadline, allow for their availability. Do they have meetings or holidays scheduled between now and the deadline? You're going to need to factor that in. Another thing you need to think about with the plan is the evidences and proofs that I'll discuss in more detail in a moment, but the resources that you need to put within this tender. So that might be a photo library. Do you have a good photo library of images that you can include within the response, or perhaps screenshots? Are there case studies being requested, and if so, do you have them prepared? If you have them prepared, are they relevant to this tender? Do they need tidying up and tweaking a bit? So these are all things that are going to be relevant to building the responses, even though they're not in the text of the response that you write. They're things that you're going to depend upon. Once you've formed the plan and everyone's had a good read through of the tender, you need to decide if there are any clarifications that your organisation, that your business wants to raise with the buyer. When I was a buyer, not enough people use the opportunity to raise clarification questions. So we might have 5 or 10 suppliers all answering the same question, but all doing it in a completely different way, probably because we hadn't phrased the question correctly and it had left it open to interpretation. So use the opportunity to raise a question and make sure that they phrased it correctly and that perhaps their specification hasn't been correctly. The buyers are experts in buying and procurement. They're not experts in your industry, you are. So you can use that clarification window to perhaps alert them to the fact that there's details not quite correct or something that just doesn't read right. The only thing you do have to bear in mind when you're raising a clarification, which I do encourage you to do, is how you tone it. If it's someone that you're not working with at the moment, this clarification could be your first impression on the buyers. So it needs to have a good, polite tone to it. It could cross-reference to paragraph numbers or question numbers, so it's easy for them to relate to what you're asking and then provide you with a good response. I did receive aggressive clarifications in my time as a buyer because quite often businesses would get quite defensive where we would get things wrong, and I can appreciate now being on the other side of the house why that's the case, but still it doesn't make a good first impression on the buyer if it's an aggressive question that's kind of making a point really. So going back to the project plan, you've got all your team members involved, the responses are starting to take shape, but you've got to think about those team members and their individual deadlines, because someone's going to need to pull the document together and you need to think about how you're going to work back from the final submission deadline. Moving on to evidences and proofs. So this is how you really answer every question well. It is vitally important to put relevant evidence and proof within each response that you write. I'm not suggesting that you waffle and you put too much information into a response just for the sake of it, but you do need to answer the question quite fully. This will make the difference when your tender is scored by the buyers of an average to low score, which is what a response like this would achieve, to a high score, to a good to high score. So this is an example. This is just an extract example that I've pulled in for today. So the question the buyer is asking: how would you ensure the safety of authority members of staff whilst carrying out work at the premises? Typical response, sort of thing I used to see: we always ensure that our staff work carefully at our customer premises and complete risk assessments where required. So it's positive, it answers the question, and you're referring to risk assessments. But there's no evidence of that, there's no proof. So I would suggest a much fuller response, and this example goes to about here. But what I'm suggesting here is a screenshot of your risk assessment document, so they know it exists, they know that you use it. Within the response, we've talked through the asbestos register that might be used, the safety file, and COSH. There's also reference to site safety checklists. So it's still answering the question, but it's proving what you do. It's being very, very specific, and it's giving them a meaningful answer, so they can see that that does actually happen. Another trick for responding to questions and providing evidence and show you understand what they want is to use their language. So take the language of the question and take the language of their specifications and use it back to them, because it shows you get what they want and what they're trying to buy. One thing that absolutely does not work on any level as evidence within a tender process is a cut and paste from your brochure or a cut and paste from your website. They've probably seen it when they've done their market research before they've gone to tender, and it does not keep your response specific to what they're looking for. It's just a quick way of filling that gap, and it won't achieve those high scores. Another thing, sorry, before going on to final documents, another thing you need to consider with the full documents is that even if you haven't raised a clarification and you have no background with them, so the document that they receive from you is the first impression you make on them, the more care and attention to detail you put into the document, the better impression it's going to make of them generally. It's going to put them in a good frame of mind and enable them to think that if you look after the tender this well, you're going to look after them just as well. So you're at final document stage, you're working towards the end of your project plan. You've worked back from the deadline, as I've already spoken about. It's now time, about 5 to 7 days before the ultimate deadline for submission, to get a fresh pair of eyes to read the tender. By a fresh pair of eyes, I mean someone within your business, within your organisation, but not someone that's worked on the tender. Someone that can see it clearly, someone that can see any repetition that might exist. Because once you've been looking at this for 2, 3, 4 weeks, you get to a point where you can't see the wood for the trees. So you want them to look at the quality of the submission, the overall presentation. Is it easy on the eye? Does it flow well? And does it keep the reader interested? The buyer might have 5 responses to read, they might have 15. You want to keep them interested in yours above all others that they'll be looking at that day. So this proofread is your quality assurance really. Once that proofread has taken place and you have your further amendments to make once your colleague has done that, you'll then be able to finalise the document and have it ready to submit. Most tenders that we deal with now are online submissions, so I'm just going to talk about preparing yourself for submitting for an online submission. Everything's finalised. You then take a copy of it on a memory stick, and you take a copy of all the attachments that are relevant and that you are submitting. You have a laptop that is charged and has internet access to hand. So that when you sit down to submit, you know you have a fallback. If BT cut through the pipes down the road and you lose all power and you lose all your broadband. If you're submitting on the day of submission and something like that happens, even though it's beyond your control, the buyer will not extend the deadline for you and you will have missed your opportunity. You should never submit on the day anyway. You should always aim to submit within a couple of days in advance of the deadline, but if you are submitting close to, have it backed up elsewhere, have secondary internet access, have somewhere you can go to make sure that that tender does go in on time. And feedback. At each stage of the tender process, whether it be the PQQ stage or the ITT stage, the buyer will communicate back to you your success within that stage of the process. And you're entitled to ask for feedback on your submission to that stage. It's really useful to get that feedback. Whether you win, whether you do not win, you can learn from the process that you've just been through, which will add to tenders and to your next stage of the process. If you get through the PPQ stage to ITT, that's fantastic, but still seek the feedback. Find out where maybe you can improve. You might be able to seek pointers where your ITT could then be better, things you may not have considered could be improved upon. During my time as a buyer, obviously I did give feedback to companies that weren't successful. I did give feedback to winners as well. They wanted to know how they could raise their game even higher for when they tendered to other authorities and other organisations. So it's really useful. It's there to be taken. So, do use that opportunity. Get the most you can out of them, really. Okay, good.
Thank you, Vicky. Right, well, see, it's like falling off a log, isn't it, really? All you've got to do is find them, fill them in, and service them. As you've seen all the way through that process, effective communication is potentially the difference between success and failure. And just doing the bare minimum is not enough. I'm going to look at effective communication in the scenario of you've done pretty well, you've got shortlisted, and they then want to see the colour of your eyes, or in my case one eye, because one's just red and bloodshot, but that's another story altogether. And they then want to actually build that rapport and relationship with you. But that rapport and relationship, as you've already heard from Vicky and Ian, you've been building from the very first time you put pen to paper. Everything you've written and said is creating that positive or not image that you have with them. But I'm going to focus on some of the things that when you potentially get more face-to-face involvement with them might be relevant to them. So, what is effective communication? Well, first of all, it's to the point. It's focused. It addresses their needs. Not what you want to talk about, but what they want to talk about. This process is not about you, it's about them, it's about what they need. So be focused on what they need. It's clear. Ian threw in a whole load of anachronisms and other bits of trade jargon. We all use them in our day-to-day lives. But when you're filling in these processes, don't. As Vicky said, a lot of the time you'll be dealing with people whose job is to procure. They're experts at procurement, but they know diddly squat about the actual service that's being procured, which means if you throw industry language in, it goes straight over their heads. Okay, so they should know it. Why would you take a chance on making your bid not appear quite so favourable as someone else's bid just because you've used industry jargon? My advice would be, do you know what? Don't. Don't even give them half a chance of actually thinking poorly of your business because they don't understand what it is that you're saying. And thirdly, be memorable, but be memorable positively. I give you an example of someone not memorable positively, a picture that many of you have seen before. I'm going to talk about a picture means 1,000 words, but in that case, that one really does do just what it says on the tin. When you're presenting to people, when you're dealing with people on a face-to-face basis, your presentation basically falls into two parts, the verbal and the non-verbal communications. And again, I know some of you have heard this from me before. The verbal, the what you say, the tone of how you say it, forms a significant minority of how you communicate that message. But that's all, it's a significant minority. Now, because it's a significant minority, and again, as Ian and Vicky have already said, to reinforce that, you need to use your words carefully. You need to make sure you address things in the right tone. Don't allow any opportunity for things to be misinterpreted or misunderstood or misrepresented. And with written communication only, that's particularly difficult. I'm sure we can all relate to examples of emails or texts or letters that we've received where we've taken entirely the wrong interpretation of something because of the tonality as we've interpreted it. So when you're writing something, think very carefully about how you want the other person to receive it. So we'll focus on the words in your tone. With your non-verbal communication, it involves all of these things here, which I'm not going to list out for you because I don't want to insult you with that. There's a couple I will pick on, which are my personal prejudices, for example. And the most important of those is your image. Do you look professional? For me, for example, if I'm dealing with people and they come in, it's a gentleman wearing a tie, and they haven't got their top button done up, and they haven't got their tie to the top, that's a no-no. That's the second thing I look at. The first thing I look at is their shoes. Are their shoes polished? Now, that's a ridiculous example, and you can't not be awarded a contract for that reason. You can't. It's just not defendable. You didn't get the business because your shoes weren't polished. No. But what are you doing? You're creating a negative image in their mind that will probably mean that when they score you, they'll score you slightly more cynically on your good stuff than they do on others. Now that's not measurable, it's not objective, and it's not right. But why even give them the opportunity? Why take the risk on that? Why not just eliminate all of those things? Think about those tiny details, get them all right, and therefore make them think positively of you, because the converse could be true, that they might see something that you've not quite expressed right, but they know that. But because they think you look the part, you look professional, you're acting the right way, you seem to be delivering all those things, they'll perhaps score you more optimistically. Perhaps. I certainly wouldn't be prepared to take the chance on the other. So, imagine you've got a very short space of time. In America they call this the elevator pitch, but you've got, say, 45 seconds to a minute to communicate with your potential client. Think about what it is you really must tell them. The first point of there says sell the sizzle. What is that trying to say? That says don't tell them what you do, tell them what they can get as a result of what you do. Because they don't want to know we go from A to B, B to C, C to D. Jesus, that's boring. You've got to do that because that's why you get the contract. But what they want to know is if you, by doing that, they get that. It's some kind of assurance, some kind of reassurance that they have no worries. They're not going to be kept awake at night. So that's selling the sizzle. Secondly, focus on the key issues. In other words, keep out of the detail. And again, I've said it before, the key issues as far as they're concerned, not your key issues. They don't care what key issues you've got. They want to know that you understand what they need and that you're on the case for it. And most importantly, tell them how what your company is going to do is going to address their issues. That's the nub of what it's all about. Not what you do, but how you resolve their issues and take them away from them. Say, have an easy life. That's what we're about doing. That's building the trust and the rapport and the empathy with them. And the thing about slides, which is my personal thing, where I get really, really wound up. I started with this slide with just a picture here. To me, you don't need to put any more on there. Do I need to tell you how that felt to those two ladies, Catherine Granger and her partner, who was called? Come on, well, you're not watching the Olympics. I was, but I can't remember either. Anyway, that's fine. I'm just trying to catch you out on that and see if you're listening to me. The other slide over here, this is words about how you should format a slide. Well, it struck me that the words about how you should format a slide were of themselves a fantastic example of what you should not do on slides. In other words, fill them full of words. Because quite frankly, I don't want to insult you. Well, two things. One, hopefully you can't read it. I certainly can't, but that's another story altogether. But equally, I don't want you to focus on those. I want you to, and you should think about this, you want your audience to focus on you, because it's you they buy. If they take your company on, they're buying you. So you want them focused on you, not on these bits and bobs here. By all means, put something up here that's evocative, that actually gives them the flavour of what you want to do. This is all about positivity, and I'll come back onto that in a second. We have to forget 95% of what we take in during the day, because we're just bombarded with information. We've had the radio on, we've had our mobile phones going, we've read the newspaper, we've had all this stuff checked out of you this morning. 95% of the words that you've heard are going to wash in and wash out. And that's our brain's defense mechanism from blowing itself up. However, what you do want to do, and hopefully what we've tried to do and what you want to do in your business every day, is create a positive impression with people and make people feel positive. Make them trust you, make them have empathy with you, make them believe that you are the right company for them to do business with, because that is what they remember. Go back to our friend Mr. Bush, with his head in his hands. How good does that make you feel? I don't think so. Here's an example. If I said, I'm very excited to present to you this morning, you all heard the words, I'm sure, and you all understood that I said I was very excited to be here. But I'm betting that less than 3 in 10 of you would actually believe me because of the way I said it, with my shoulders down, tone flat. Whereas just saying, I'm very excited to be here, it's perhaps a little OTT, but I'm very excited to be here. There's some kind of sincerity, some genuineness in that communication that hopefully carries it forward and is more memorable than the sheer words themselves. And again, just think that through when you're talking through. Benefits are the key. People don't care what you do. Clearly you need to be able to deliver the service, particularly in this industry, so they do care what you do. But for the sake of what I'm saying, they don't. They don't want to know, well, what we do is we put the widget in and we screw it up left to right. They want to know that the widget won't come undone. They want to know the widget will actually do something for them. They want to know what they get, which are benefits. So for example, can I just borrow your pen, Ian, please? Like a preparation, should have brought my own pen, but that's another story. I can say this pen has a flip top, which means that it won't, if I were to put it in my pocket like that, it won't draw on the inside of my shirt or suit. So what? That's a feature. So what? Which means, it has a flip top. Sorry, give you both the feature and the benefit there. I got ahead of myself. If I retract that, it won't write on my shirt. That's the feature of the pen. The benefit is, so what? So I don't end up with an inky stain on my shirt. That's the benefit to me, is that I keep a clean shirt. Or it has a nice grip factor on here, which means that if my hands are slippery, I can actually continue to write with it quite effectively. So you're delivering things that mean something to the audience, not some factor about your business. We've all got lots and lots of features we want to say about our businesses. You must resist the temptation to do that and talk benefits. If you can say something and then you can't answer the question, so what? It's not a benefit. So you always want to answer, this something does something, so what? When you answer what the so what question is, that's the benefit. So use that as your acid test. And finally, if you are being interviewed or making a presentation, there is a myth that we didn't put up, which is that, do you know what, you can over-rehearse. And if we over-rehearse, we lose spontaneity. Do you know what? That's crap, with respect. I come from the school that says you cannot over-rehearse these things. You shouldn't rehearse until you know what you're going to say, or how you're going to say it. You shouldn't rehearse until you don't even have to think about it, so that you actually just get up there and do it. I put a tightrope walking analogy up here. What's the risk of this person not practicing until they get it wrong? Clearly, it's life-threatening. Now, I'm not suggesting that presentations are life-threatening. They're a bit stressful, I'll grant you, but they're not life-threatening. However, again, why take the risk? A good presentation may not win you this contract in the bid, but I can guarantee that a poor one will make sure you don't win. And again, therefore, why take the risk? As Vicky said, we've all presented lots and lots of times. Therefore, we all think we're reasonably good at it. Well, I'm a reasonably competent driver. I drive 30 to 40,000 miles a year, and I've been doing it for 30 years. Does that make me a great driver, a good driver? No, I can stay alive. I'm competent. Put me in a car with, against someone like Schumacher or anyone else that's a proper professional at that game, they're going to whip me into the ground. Now, if you're happy to make average presentations, as I am happy to be an average driver, that's great. But if you want to win this business, I suggest that you want to aspire to being in the top level again of that. So practice, practice, practice. So let's try and summarise all that. We've thrown a lot of information at you today. On behalf of Vicky, Ian and myself, many thanks for listening to this. We're going to take questions in a little while. But let's try and summarise what it is about contract business that could be of benefit to you. Well, clearly, the first one is it's an opportunity to develop your business, to grow turnover, but profitably. Sanity is profit, turnover is vanity, as is often the same. Yes, it helps increase your credibility within both the business community, with your competitors, and in the business circles generally. So there's actually positive benefits to be had from that. And having one piece of business is actually very helpful in terms of getting others. Because once you've got one as a backdrop, you can say, here's one that we've done, and we've done it well. You can use that as case studies back, as Vicky's alluded to. And thirdly and finally, to win this kind of business, you have to have robust processes and procedures in your business. Just having those robust processes and procedures in your business is good for your business per se. Therefore, actually going through the process, even if you don't win it, and actually tightening up the way your business operates and does things is good, will help your business whether you win or you don't win, and will help you win the next time around. So hopefully that's 3 excellent reasons why you might want to consider looking at contract business. Why might you be interested in engaging us, other than the fact we'd like you to? This chart basically summarises some of the people with whom we've worked to get secure business with these people. In short, our business is helping the likes of you get business with the likes of them. Not going to point out any of those specifically, but you can see they are very broad in terms of some of them are nationals and multinationals. Some of them are, there's a broad range of sectors in there, and a broad range of different sizes and opportunities of contract available for us all. So those are the kind of people that, you're the kind of people that we work with to help get business with these kind of people here. On which happy note, it's question time. We've probably got about 15 minutes. So if you've got any questions, please ask them now. No?
I've got one.
Oh, ladies, let the lady go first. Although your hand up was first.
Is there anything I can do in advance of the tender coming in to prepare it? Is there anything I can put in place before that would help?
Yeah, in terms of tender readiness, Ian touched very briefly on the PPQ stage. Now, sometimes the PPQ, the tender ready kind of questions would be included in the ITT, but the things you want to have in place are all your policy documents that Ian referred to briefly. So your health and safety, your business continuity, your quality.
Various policies, the
Yeah.
certificates.
Yeah, so you need to have them current and in play. Did I not say it? Oh, I'm sorry. Equal opportunities, which is a very important one, which this lady, I can tell you on a number of occasions, can help you with for a tender process, and she's helped some of my clients just in the last couple of weeks. specifically on equality. So it's having all those documents ready to go, in a ready to go state, and if they're not current, if they're not up to date, if they haven't been reviewed and signed off by the MD in the last year, then they're not really in a good position to submit. So if a tender's come out and you've got 6 weeks to complete it, but you've got to revise all your policy documents and bring them up to date within that 6 weeks as well, it's going to take a massive amount of time away from the tender completion. So it's making sure everything's current, annually current, on the policy and the procedural side of things, because they will need them as evidence. Also think about associations, trade memberships, that kind of thing. They often ask to see that kind of information.
Claire?
Yeah.
Unless I've misunderstood, much of the presentation I think focused on public sector tendering, and yet your penultimate slide, quite a few of your clients were private sector. Increasingly finding we're tendering for private sector business. I just wonder whether any of your advice today differed when thinking about private sector tendering rather than public sector.
In terms of process and procedures, I think you'll find the public sector is much more process and procedure driven.
Yeah.
However, the private sector is increasingly coming under pressure to demonstrate best value back to shareholders, for example. So, no, I think the broad principles would hold true across both sectors. And yes, you're right, there is a kind of a weighting back across that, because when we look at what we've done in the last 18 months, that's how it just happened to turn out, whereas we thought that looking forward for opportunities, the public sector would represent a better opportunity for you guys, so we'd make more of a focus on that today. Is that a reasonable?
Yeah, I think that's fair enough, but dealing with a PLC or somebody like BP is in many ways just almost the same as dealing with a public sector organisation. I suppose a key difference is the public sector have to advertise, they have to make sure their tenders are widely available, whereas with the private sector, it's not so easy to find out when they're tendering. Having said that, some of the larger PLCs, especially where they're acting on behalf of the public sector, their tenders are often publicised in just the same way, because they're serving the public sector. So very little difference, really.
Is there a lead-in time sort of for tenders, or is that part of the process? And I'm sort of thinking, you sort of said you've got to put in, whether you're going to have to buy equipment or you might have to recruit staff and things. Obviously that's going to take you time, and you're not going to want to do that unless you know you've got a contract. Is there a sort of, or is that part of the process? Yes, I could do this, but I would need.
Well, if the procurement's being run properly, they will allow for a suitable implementation period.
For a large scale of contract, it's quite typical to see sort of a 3-month implementation period. And if the buyers are thinking about implementation, they will question you within the tender, and you'll put an outline implementation plan in, the sort of things you'll do when you get notified of the contract award, and the next steps that you'll be taking. You might need extra staff, you might need bigger premises, that kind of thing. As I say, for the larger scale contracts, but you discussed an example where you had a client who had 3 weeks to implement the contract recently. So
that was a badly run.
Yeah, it depends on the buyers.
But you would know that there was 3 weeks, so you could say, well, I can't deliver it.
There's usually a timetable in the PQQ, and then another timetable which will be updated because they probably fallen behind by a couple of weeks in the ITT, which will outline that kind of thing. So they would normally say that they intend to award on such and such a date. They'll then allow 10 days after that for the challenges in the standstill period, and then they would have a final award date when everything's set in stone, and then there would be a contract go live or a contract start date, and they're very rarely the same date.
If we went back to the taxi example that Ian talked about, there was a considerable IT investment required in that particular contract for tracking all the cars and what have you. So what the client that Ian and I worked with did was actually talk to their IT people to pre-warn them, not to place the order, but we may well be placing if, so that they were geared up rather than just say, I need it and I've got 3 months to get it. Because, again, just passing that information down the supply chain was actually beneficial, so they were then able to complete that. And the client did ask, have you spoken to your supply chain, and have you pre-warned them that you may well need to do this and be ready to go by day one, have it up and running and ready by day 90 in that case.
Yeah, in that case, the contract contract start date was almost 6 months after we did all the work on the tender. But because of the scale of it, they allowed plenty of time to do this. And there were some duty transfers as well from the previous contractor. You know all about those.
Could we get a copy of the slides at all?
Just
to say you're right
yes.
and all of that.
Yeah, I think.
Yeah, Sean normally puts them up on the
He
board.
does, okay. The question was, obviously, when you said about you done your bid evaluation as to whether you're going to bid or not, but you're going to think you're going to win it, but that's not always the case. What would be a sort of an expectation of a win-loss sort of ratios, you know, percentage? I mean, I know you want to win every one you go for, but that's not practical. Let's say, what should you, I don't know, what would you say is a typical?
It's always a tricky one. I mean, I've heard of people who do things like contract cleaning, and those say they only win 1 bid in 10, which is a bit low. I think the ideal is if you're winning 50% of the tenders you submit, you're doing quite well. If you're winning 75 or 80%, you might be underpricing a bit. So, and although we said earlier that cost isn't everything, I mean, it's obviously a crucial factor. But
That kind of dovetails with the importance of feedback. If you're going in and you're not successful, the feedback is absolutely crucial to answer that, because that feedback will then enlighten you as to whether you think maybe the neighbouring council or the neighbouring NHS authority will then, would you be in with a good chance of winning with them? Having received that feedback, you're going to know the fundamental areas that might make a difference. So that kind of, you need to use that in making future decisions, I think, after you've been through one process, because it will inform your success.
Yeah, sure.
It's industry specific. If you're selling pens, then you could have 20 people potentially want to supply pens. If you're selling something much more of a high-tech nature, you may only have 3 or 4 competitors. So automatically you're scaling the
When they do the tenders, do they have to have, let's say for instance, it's, you know, it's supply only, do they have to have a certain number of bidders to make it fair in the public service? Do they have to say, right, we have to have 5 quotes?
They quite often use 5 at an ITT stage as a minimum number of suppliers they want to see, because it's enabling.
Yes.
Sorry.
Yeah, the early bit.
It's enabling them to really sort of go out to the market and test the market quite well. But as you appreciate, like with pens, there's more than 5 key brands that are going to supply pens to a public sector authority. So it's I've lost track of the question. Sorry.
How many would it be that there has to be a minimum number of bidders to award a contract
They
in
would
the public
generally,
services?
for an EU level of tender, they will state up front in the contract notice, where you get on TED, Tenders Electronic Daily, they will actually state within the contract notice, which is the bit that says, hello, we're Devon and Cornwall Police, we're out to tender for equipment vests, we would like to take 5 suppliers through to ITT stage, so they'll actually state it up front on the higher value contracts. I think 3 would be a reasonable minimum to work with, but we do tend to see sort of 5, 8.
Another question on that side then, sorry do they share who's tendered at the end in terms of companies? You know, when it's awarded, will
They'll
they
tell
say...
you the winner, they'll tell you the winner,
Right, okay.
and they'll tell you the information specific to yourself, but you won't know if everyone else in your industry tendered.
Right. So you won't know who your competitors are in that. You don't generally find that out then in the bidding process.
if you go to a pre-contract meeting,
Yeah.
if you're a pre-tender meeting, then you'll obviously find out who's there.
Ah, of course, yeah.
And that doesn't always happen, but with a large contract, then people are invited along. The buyers will perhaps tell you what the exercise is all about. And if you read the signing in sheet when you're checking, you'll probably recognise some of them. People don't usually say much in case they give anything away, but obviously that's one way of finding out who's competing for it. Go to the pre-tender meeting.
You should always go to any of those kind of events anyway, if you are interested in supplying the public sector. They're well worth attending, whether it's specific to one tender or whether it's a general open day, which Plymouth had in October. Go and meet and get a feel for what they like, what's important to them. You know, the environment's important to Exeter City Council, but it might not be to Plymouth, and that kind of thing. So those kind of days are really good to make use of anyway.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. got a question for us?
I've got my shoes clean, that's all I was going to say. No, I just wanted to say, I've actually survived the working with Vicky for the last 2 years, and you know, for all those who are thinking about the tender process, first getting tender ready, it actually highlights, and our industry, our company has been going 40 years, and so we had this tender readiness assessment, and we were doing everything, but we couldn't actually put our hands on any documents to sort of justify what we were doing, and so that moved us ahead, and it actually changed the whole culture of the our MDs and our other staff members to work better with our ISO standards. And then we realised, we've been in for tenders now, and we've been into 2 or 3, some where the references weren't relevant, you know, so we had good references, but it wasn't quite actually a reference for that type of job. And so the support from Vicky has actually brought us forward now, where we've just invested over sort of £50,000 in technology, because we need to be ready for that next big contract, and we've actually just won 2 or 3 contracts. One of them an existing client who actually went through the PPQ, and we were already dealing with that contract, but they had to tender it out. We had all the information there, we sent it there within 2 days, and we won that contract 3 years, and that was literally, it was quite amazing, because we would never have actually won it before going through all this tender process, which is quite, you have to be quite patient. You're going to have to take your defences off, because it's not, seriously, it looks at everything, and you may think you're painting the right picture, but if you get a set of fresh eyes, but quite neutral, quite brutal as she can be, I tell you what, it is. Then you will sort of, you look back 2 years later, and I wanted to come here just to see how much information they give, and I've been through all those screens, and it's definitely worth it. My MD, we went to a tender, and he actually says, getting to a tender interview meeting, he said, it's like getting to the finals in the Champions League. He said, you don't care whether you win it, you're just happy to be there. You know, so it was, you know, it does, you know, for those of you who've got the organisation, just have a look at it, because it's definitely helped us.
Brilliant.
Helped you on Dragon's Den before you did.
That one might be easier.
Or young apprentice. Oh yeah. The apprentice. Sorry, any other? Sorry, yeah.
I think Richard.
Sorry, let's come and let Richard have a chat. He's not.
Yeah, if you find an opportunity and you look at it and you think, well, actually, I can supply a lot of it, but I can't supply all of it, is there a danger in still applying? Do you have to qualify it, or can you still go ahead?
If the tender that's been advertised is lotted, so it's lotted into 3 different streams, maybe 3 streams of product type or 3 streams of service type, and you can fit one of those lots entirely, then great, go for it and just go for that one lot, because they're looking for perhaps to award the contract to multiple suppliers. If, however, you can, it's one whole contract, but you can only supply part of it, like you said, you might want to look at partnering with someone, put a collaborative bid together, work together through this process, but do it as a joint effort, so you can complement each other and win it together.
Would you have to have documentation in place to show that it was a proper joint venture? Or?
Yes.
Yeah, it needs to be quite strong.
Show it
Consortium
quite
bids are quite are welcome now in the public sector, whereas once they wouldn't have been. So they actually encourage that for that very reason. So you might get people join forces with a competitor, but it must be very clear that the consortium is strong and just who's got responsibility for various aspects.
Yeah, they will look for someone to take ultimate responsibility. There'll be sort of one signature on the final dotted line, but through all the questions in the process, you'll have to evidence how both can deliver both and how you joined up and how you work well together.
Yeah, so it's not precluded to going forward.
Not
You can
at all.
find the right people to align with and collaborate with, and it's what we do on a much more informal scale, in fairness. But it's kind of how we work in a handling level basis. Thanks, Richard.
The only thing you didn't mention in preparing for a bid is your existing online presence.
Right.
When I think Vicky said they're often, procurement people are often out there in advance, so you actually already got an impression out there in advance, so is that something that that you talk to clients about?
In terms of,
Yeah.
in
Web
terms of like
presence.
you having a web presence?
Absolutely.
Or,
Yeah.
Yeah. What your web presence actually looks like and whether that's even relevant.
Well, I suppose
I think
we'd assumed, we think you've just got to have a presentable website if you go in for these opportunities,
because
They
there is
will look
normally
you
a
up.
degree, yeah, there's a degree of market research that should go in before they go out to tenders, so they should be having a look around, see who the key players are, maybe
Right.
see who some of the smaller guys are. So yeah, a presence would be important. It wouldn't be essential unless obviously it's some web-related industry or business that, you know, it's going to be fundamental that you have something like that. I wouldn't say it's essential, but it depends on what you're tendering for. I don't know what your business area is.
I guess you'd always want to be creating the right impression. So if you've got any concerns about your online presence, then I'd say you should go ahead and address it regardless of whether you go for these opportunities, because even if it's not affecting a formal contract, someone else that might stumble across or find your website and your web presence is going to take the wrong impression of your business, and who might they know, who might they speak to, who might they write to, who might, you know, how
Just
might that
thinking
domino
if
trip?
it's public sector, they finding your ISO certification and stuff easily on the site and stuff, you know, things like that.
Yeah, that is all useful, but you'll still have to submit it.
Yeah.
If they need to see it, they need to see it. So you wouldn't be able to put a link into the website. You would have to attach the certificate and put it in also. But I mean, going back to sort of web presence, just thinking back to when I was a buyer, you'd see the expressions of interest coming in, and you'd see all the people you'd expect to see. You might see a couple of other players, and I would go and have a look. So yeah, the presence is important, and the more robust that is in terms of your accreditation in, you know, your industry associations or whatever, then the better impression it's going to make. That's one of those non-school things.
With ISO, does it make it a lot easier or not? Is it worth having ISO?
For the higher value contracts, definitely yes. If you're looking at going for the high value contracts, then you do want to have it, because the buyer can just tick a box and say they've got quality sorted. If you haven't, you're going to have to explain the lengths and extremes you go to ensure quality.
Which just slows you
And
down.
then they've got to read that and then perhaps score it. And quite often, I mean, ISO in a tender that was submitted on Monday this week for a client of mine was a pass-fail.
yeah, increasingly they want 14001 as well.
Environmental.
Yeah.
So another, yeah.
So just following on from what Vicky said in response to Richard's first question about partnering, do you find you win more business by working loosely as a partnership with the three of you? Because actually, if you're looking at businesses, you could be directly in competition to each other.
Oh, us three specifically?
Yeah, you three specifically.
Shall I answer that one? I should have said at the beginning that what Ian and Vicky do is interchangeable.
Right.
So they both cover both aspects of that. But we've all collaborated, both Ian and Vicky together, Ian and I and Vicky and I together. So the answer is, do we win more business? The short answer is yes, we do, because we're able to offer a broader service to our client base, and therefore accept and get
Do you offer that when you're pitching?
It tends to come up as part of the early conversation. If I'm talking about someone who wants me to help with a presentation, then it's okay, but Hugh, can you help us with the bid writing and whatever, in which case I say no, but I know select some people who can, and we go in very openly as Ian and I, or Vicky and I, or the reverse happens. You know, it gets to the end of the tender stage, and then the client suddenly finds out they've got an interview to do. What do we do? And then I get the call, so it kind of works both ways.
I mean, obviously we're delivering something very similar, so there are times when we're competitors, but we've also, you know, we've worked together on a number of occasions with, you know,
Yes,
bids
and
for clients.
well,
so
obviously the nature of our work is we sometimes get very, very busy, and it's useful to have a colleague that, you know, we can pass a project on to or share the workload. Obviously that can work either way. In the case of the big contract with the BBC that you and I have talked about, they couldn't have won that contract, without my meticulous response to the PricewaterhouseCoopers ITT document, which was like that. But similarly, people who've never been before a tender evaluation panel before, without Hugh's coaching, they couldn't have convinced the BBC that they were the company to go with. So in that case, both of us were absolutely joyful to winning the contract, helping the client win. So, but it is really good to work together and very, very effective.
My one question, it's a vote of thanks. Sean had to go downstairs to set one up, so he asked me to say a big vote of thanks to you for doing the seminar. I don't know about anyone else, but it's been really informative. I think you've busted a lot of myths, made it less scary. So, Ian and Vicky, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Lunch, I think, is downstairs in the room below us, the dinner room, so if anyone wants to move downstairs.
Yeah.
Lunch, drinks,
Our contact details are here. We've got our cards.
You
So.
two around, it's two, how many are up there? Three. The questions now over lunch.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Did you? Oh yeah.